The American West, 1880, where the sky was painted in red dust and hearts bore scars just as deep. Among forgotten towns, echoing gunshots and midnight whispers, lived stories never written in books, only passed down through memories and tears. This is one of those stories, about a woman left behind, a man who thought he had lost everything, and a land that could either bury you or redeem you. If you love emotional stories like this, don't forget to hit like, share it with others, and leave a comment below. And where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. We'd love to see how far our Western-loving community reaches. Now, let's watch till the very end, because some endings will stay with you forever. Cowboy Hat.
In the rugged expanse of the Wyoming Territory, 1875, fate weaves an extraordinary tale of loss and redemption. James Hawkins rides alone these days, the shadow of his wife's murder haunting every trail he crosses. When he stumbles upon the aftermath of a brutal wagon massacre, the seasoned cowboy expects to find only death. Instead, he discovers a single survivor, a young woman clinging to life among the carnage. Following his conscience, he brings her to his isolated mountain cabin, nursing her back from death's doorstep as memories of his late wife guide his healing hands. But as the stranger awakens, a simple golden locket around her neck stops James cold. He knows every scratch on that delicate chain, every curve of its engraving. It's the same necklace his beloved Sarah wore the day she died. Could this mysterious woman hold the key to his wife's unsolved murder? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver band on James Hawkins' finger had worn smooth over the years, polished by worry and remembrance. As he sat beside the unconscious woman's bed, his calloused thumb traced the familiar groove where the ring's pattern had once been clear and sharp, just like his memories of Sarah. 5 years had passed since that autumn morning when he'd kissed Sarah goodbye at their modest ranch outside Cheyenne. The day began like any other, Sarah tending to her herb garden while humming that gentle tune she'd brought with her from Boston, her golden locket catching the morning light. She'd inherited the piece from her grandmother, an elegant thing, with intricate engravings that seemed too fine for frontier life. But Sarah wore it every day, claiming it reminded her that beauty could flourish anywhere. "I'll be back before sunset," he'd promised, heading out to mend fences on the north pasture. He'd been learning to appreciate Sarah's touches of refinement. In their rugged life, the pressed wildflowers she kept in books, the proper china cups she insisted on using for their evening tea, the way she'd taught him to read by lamplight during those long winter evenings. James had met her 3 years earlier when she arrived on the stage from Boston, determined to work as the town's schoolteacher. She'd seemed so out of place with her clean skirts and proper manners, but there was steel beneath her gentle exterior. While other newcomers wilted under the harsh Wyoming sun, Sarah had thrived, combining Eastern education with frontier practicality. She learned to shoot straight, ride astride when needed, and mix healing poultices from native plants, all while maintaining the grace that had first caught his eye. Their courtship had been swift but sure, like a clear stream running over smooth stones. Within 6 months, they'd married in the town church, Sarah wearing a dress she'd sewn herself and that precious locket gleaming at her throat. They built their life together piece by piece. The ranch house with its neat vegetable patch, the growing herd of cattle, the rooms they'd planned to fill with children. But fate had other plans. When James returned that autumn evening, the setting sun painted their home in shades of blood. The front door stood open, Sarah's flowers trampled into the dirt. Inside, overturned furniture and broken china told the story his heart couldn't bear to read. He found her in their bedroom, the floor dark with her blood, the locket torn from her throat. The sheriff came, made his notes, promised to investigate. Whispers around town suggested cattle rustlers, Or maybe that gang that had been terrorizing settlements up north, but no arrests were made, no justice served. The only clue was a single playing card left behind, the Queen of Hearts, marked with a strange symbol in silver ink. Grief drove James into the mountains, where he built his cabin far from any reminder of their shared dreams. He buried himself in solitude, taking odd jobs, tracking outlaws, or guiding hunting parties. Anything to keep moving, to stop the memories from settling too deep. His wedding ring remained his one connection to the life he'd lost, a constant reminder of love's price. Now, watching the rise and fall of the wounded woman's chest, James felt the weight of memory press against him. Her dark hair, splayed across his spare pillow, was nothing like Sarah's golden waves. Yet something in her face, perhaps the gentle curve of her cheek or the determined set of her jaw, even in unconsciousness, echoed with familiar strength. The locket that had stopped him cold lay on the rough-hewn table beside the bed. He'd removed it carefully while tending her wounds, his hands trembling at the familiar weight. Every scratch matched his memory. The small dent near the clasp from when Sarah had dropped it while mounting her horse, the worn spot on the back where her thumb would worry the metal when she was deep in thought. It was impossible, yet here it was, carried by a stranger into his solitary world. Outside, snow began to fall, thick flakes muffling the world beyond his cabin walls. James added another log to the fire, settled deeper into his chair, and prepared for a long night of questioning everything he thought he knew about his wife's death. The Queen of Hearts he'd kept all these years seemed to burn in his shirt pocket, demanding answers he wasn't sure he was ready to face. James found the torn journal page while cleaning the woman's wounds. The paper was soft with wear, folded tight and tucked into her boot, the penciled writing smudged but still legible in places. He set it aside, focusing instead on the task. At hand, a long gash along her ribs that needed stitching. His fingers remembered the motions Sarah had taught him, the careful way of pulling thread through flesh. A rancher needs to know how to sew more than leather, she'd insisted, guiding his hands as she showed him how to stitch a wound on an injured ranch hand. Now those lessons kept his movements steady despite the tremor in his heart. The woman's fever burned hot as summer lightning. Through the night, she thrashed against demons he couldn't see, words spilling from her cracked lips in fragments that haunted him. Silver, the mine, have to warn. Then softer, desperate. Mother's locket, keep it safe. Each mention of the locket sent a chill down James's spine. He tended her with the supplies Sarah had left behind. Yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for fever, lavender for cleaning wounds. The familiar scents filled the cabin, stirring memories he'd thought long buried. Sarah's medicine box still sat on the high shelf where he'd placed it 5 years ago, its contents preserved by her careful organization and his inability to let go. When dawn broke the third day, he finally allowed himself to examine the journal page. Most entries were routine notes about weather and trail conditions, but one passage stood out. Met S.H. in Cheyenne, claims proof of mine owner's crimes. Arranged meeting at Echo Canyon. Must be careful, they're watching. Queen of Hearts marks the spot. James's hand went to his shirt pocket, where Sarah's playing card lay hidden. The coincidence was too stark to ignore. S.H. Sarah Hawkins. His mind reeled at the implications. Had Sarah discovered something about the mine owners? Was that why? The woman stirred, drawing his attention. Her fever had broken in the night, leaving her sleeping naturally for the first time since he'd found her. In repose, her face showed strength beneath its delicate features. Dark lashes rested against pale cheeks, and a small scar near her temple spoke of a life that knew hardship. He'd found her half-buried under the bodies of her fellow travelers, protected from the worst of the winter cold by the grim shelter of the dead. The wagon massacre had been methodical. Horses shot first to prevent escape, then the passengers picked off one by one. But the killers had been interrupted before they could check their work thoroughly, leaving one survivor behind. The scene had struck him as familiar in its brutality. Sarah's murder had held the same calculated violence, the same sense of punishment rather than mere robbery. He'd spent years trying to convince himself that the connections he saw were merely grief, playing tricks on his mind. Now, with this woman wearing Sarah's locket and carrying notes about mysterious meetings, those old suspicions gained new weight. During her fever dreams, she'd called out names: Thomas, Elizabeth, someone called the Professor. She'd begged forgiveness from people he didn't know and railed against nameless enemies. But it was her moments of lucidity that troubled him most. Sometimes her eyes would open, clear and sharp, and she'd grab his arm with surprising strength, trying to tell him something before the fever pulled her back under. James kept his own journal of her recovery, noting every word she spoke, every clue that might help him understand the web of mystery he'd stumbled into. The task gave him purpose, something to focus on besides the way his past and present were. Becoming hopelessly entangled. "You should have been a doctor," Sarah had often told him, admiring his steady hands and gentle touch with injured animals. He'd always laughed it off. What use did the frontier have for another doctor when it barely had enough people to keep the existing one busy? But now, watching over this mysterious woman, he understood what Sarah had seen in him. There was healing in the act of care itself, not just for the patient, but for the caregiver too. By the end of the first week, the woman's color had improved, and her wounds were beginning to heal clean. James allowed himself to hope she would survive, even as he dreaded the moment she would wake, and he'd have to face the questions that burned in his mind. Who was she? How did she come to possess Sarah's locket? What connection did she have to the conspiracy that had claimed his wife's life? The answers, he suspected, would change everything he thought he knew about the past 5 years. As if sensing his thoughts, the woman stirred again, and this time when her eyes opened, they held no trace of fever's confusion. She looked at him, with clear, intelligent eyes that reminded him of Sarah's in their quiet determination. It was time for answers. Sarah's medicine box sat open on the rough-hewn table, its familiar compartments holding the herbs and tinctures that had kept the stranger alive. James watched as the woman's eyes focused on her surroundings, tracking from the box to the cabin's sturdy beams, then finally settling on him. Her hand instinctively went to her throat, finding the locket missing. "It's safe," James said quietly, nodding toward the necklace laid carefully beside the medicine box. "Though I admit I'm curious how it came to be in your possession." He kept his voice gentle, mindful of how his size could be intimidating to someone in such a vulnerable position. She tried to speak, coughed, and gratefully accepted the cup of water he offered. After a few sips, she found her voice. "Catherine," she managed. "Catherine Maxwell. How long?" "8 days since I found you." James pulled his chair closer, but maintained a respectful distance. "The wagon train was attacked. You were the only survivor." Pain flickered across her face, followed by something darker. Fear, perhaps, or anger. "The others, Thomas, Elizabeth?" James shook his head slowly. "I buried them proper, marked the graves so their families can find them come spring." He didn't mention how he'd searched each body for clues, finding nothing but ordinary possessions and the same look of surprise on every face. Catherine closed her eyes, grief etching lines around her mouth that made her look older than he'd first thought, closer to 30 than 20. When she opened them again, they held the steely resolve he'd glimpsed during her fever dreams. "You've been caring for me all this time?" Her gaze fell on Sarah's medicine box again. "You know your herbs well." "My wife taught me." James paused, watching her carefully. "The same wife who once wore that locket you carried." Catherine's. Anne trembled as she reached for the necklace. "Sarah," she whispered, and James felt the name like a physical blow. "Sarah Hawkins, you're James, then." She spoke of you. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "When?" he demanded, then forced himself to soften his tone. "When did you know my wife?" "I never met her in person," Catherine said, her fingers tracing the locket's engravings just as Sarah used to do. But we corresponded. She was helping me, helping us investigate the silver mine operations. When she died—" Catherine broke off, coughing again. James waited while she drank more water, his mind racing. Sarah had never mentioned any investigation, never spoke of silver mines or mysterious correspondence. But then there had been so many small changes in her behavior those last few months. Letters she'd quickly put away when he entered the room, unexpected trips to town, the worried crease between her brows when she thought he wasn't looking. "The locket came to me through a mutual friend," Catherine continued, "a signal that I could be trusted with what Sarah had discovered. But before I could act on the information—" She gestured weakly at herself, at the healing wounds that told their own story of violence. James stood abruptly, needing to move. He paced the cabin's length, aware of Catherine watching him with those keen eyes that seemed to see too much. "Start from the beginning," he said finally. "Tell me everything." "I will," she promised. "But first I need to know, do you still have the playing card, the Queen of Hearts?" James pulled the worn card from his shirt pocket, where he'd carried it every day for 5 years. Catherine's sharp intake of breath confirmed what he'd begun to suspect. This was no coincidence. "Look at it in the firelight," she instructed. "Hold it at an angle." He did as she asked, moving closer to the hearth. There, in the flickering light, silver ink became visible across the card's face. A symbol he'd seen before, but never understood. A stylized mountain peak with what looked like a mining shaft at its center. "The Silver Legion," Catherine said softly. "They leave their mark on their victims, thinking themselves clever. But Sarah found a way to use their own symbol against them. She was documenting everything, the murders, the claim jumping, the corruption that went all the way to the territorial governor's office." James sank back into his chair, the card burning in his hand like a brand. "And now they're after you because you have her evidence." Catherine's face showed a flash of frustration. "Had it. Everything was in my trunk on the wagon, hidden in a false bottom. They must have found it, must have taken it when they—" Her voice broke, and James saw tears gathering in her eyes. "Rest," he said, recognizing the signs of exhaustion in her pale face. "We have time to sort this out. You're safe here." But even as he spoke the words, James wondered if they were true. If the Silver Legion had found Catherine once, they could find her again. Find them both. His quiet life of solitude had just become far more complicated. Catherine was already drifting back to sleep, her face troubled even in repose. The locket lay in her open palm, catching the firelight just as it used to when Sarah wore it. James added another log to the fire and settled in to watch through the night, his mind churning with new questions. The Queen of Hearts seemed to mock him from the table where he'd laid it. 5 years of grief and confusion were shifting into something else, a puzzle whose pieces were finally beginning to align. Sarah hadn't been the random victim he'd believed. She'd been killed because she was brave enough to stand against corruption, strong enough to fight back in her own quiet way. Now her fight had found its way to his door, carried by a woman who shared his wife's courage. As the winter wind howled outside his cabin walls, James Hawkins felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Purpose. The wanted poster was yellowed with age, curling at the corners where James had tacked it to his cabin wall years ago. 3 faces stared back at them, hardened men with cold eyes, known for hire work across the territory. He'd collected every scrap of information about Sarah's death, and these men had been seen in Cheyenne the week she died. Catherine studied the poster from her chair by the fire, strength returning to her limbs day by day. "Mason brothers," she said, her voice tight. "They're the Legion's preferred hunters. I saw them at Echo Canyon, leading the attack on our wagon." "You're certain?" James passed her a cup of coffee, watching her hands shake slightly as she took it. "A woman doesn't forget the faces of men who murdered her friends." She sipped the coffee, gathering her thoughts. Thomas recognized them first. He'd been tracking their movements for months, building a pattern of their attacks. "That's why we were armed, but they still overwhelmed us." James settled into his own chair. noting how Catherine's fingers worried the locket's chain, a gesture so like Sarah's it made his chest ache. "Tell me about Thomas." "Professor Thomas Whitman. He taught geology at Yale before the mine owners ruined him." Catherine's voice held equal measures of respect and grief. "He was the first to notice the pattern of claim jumping. How legitimate. Miners would strike silver only to die in accidents shortly after. The mines would then be bought for pennies by shell companies, all leading back to the Silver Legion." James nodded slowly. "Sarah mentioned a professor in her letters to you. She was helping him map the ownership trails. Her position as a teacher's wife made her invisible to them. Who would suspect a genteel woman of investigating corporate records?" A ghost of a smile touched Catherine's lips. "She was brilliant at it. Found connections we'd missed. Started building a case that would expose the whole operation." The pride in Catherine's voice echoed James's own memories of Sarah's quiet intelligence. How many evenings had he seen her bent over papers at their kitchen table, claiming to be preparing lessons? He'd never questioned it, never looked closely enough to see the truth hiding in plain sight. "The night she died," James said carefully, "she'd been into town to meet someone. The sheriff assumed it was for school supplies, but she was meeting Thomas." Catherine's confirmation hit him like a physical blow. He'd discovered something crucial about the territorial judge's involvement. But the Legion must have followed him, must have traced him back to Sarah. James stood abruptly, needing to move. The cabin's walls seemed to close in as 5 years of assumptions crumbled. He'd imagined Sarah's last moments so many times, a random attack, senseless violence. Now he pictured her facing her killers with the same courage she'd shown in life, protecting secrets that could topple an empire, built on blood and silver. "What was in your trunk?" he asked, turning back to Catherine. "What evidence did they take?" "Ledgers, property deeds, correspondence between mine owners and territorial officials, but most importantly, a catalogue of every accident orchestrated by the Legion over the past decade." She set down her coffee cup, hands clenching into fists. "Thomas had hidden copies of everything, thank God, in a place they'll never think to look." "Where?" Catherine hesitated, studying him. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her. "The old Whitman mine. It went dry years ago, but Thomas kept it as a front for our investigation. There's a hidden chamber off the main shaft, sealed up tight. Everything we collected, everything Sarah helped uncover, it's all there." James felt the weight of the Queen of Hearts in his pocket, remembered the silver symbol that had haunted his dreams for 5 years. The mine, it's in Legion territory. "Yes." Catherine met his gaze steadily. "And they're watching it. After the wagon attack, they'll be expecting someone to try for those documents. It would be suicide to go alone." The implications hung in the air between them. James looked around, his cabin, at the quiet life he'd built from grief and solitude. On the table, Sarah's medicine box sat open, her careful labels still legible after all these years. Yarrow for bleeding, willow bark for fever, justice for old wounds. "Then we don't go alone," he said finally. "There are others who've lost. Family to the Legion, others who've been waiting for a chance to fight back. We just need to find them." Catherine's eyes lit with hope and determination. "I have names, people Sarah trusted, people Thomas vetted. If even half of them will help, it's a start." James picked up the wanted poster, studying the faces of the men who had taken his wife from him. "But first, you need to tell me everything you know about the Mason brothers. Every detail, every habit, every weakness." As Catherine began to speak, snow fell softly outside the cabin windows, covering the tracks that led to their door. Winter was settling in, giving them time to plan, to heal, to build the alliance they would need. Come spring, the Silver Legion would learn the true cost of underestimating quiet people with courage in their hearts and justice in their cause. James touched his wedding ring, its smooth surface catching the firelight. For the first time in 5 years, he felt truly awake, truly alive. Sarah had died fighting for what was right. The least he could do was help finish what she'd started. The old territory map spread across James's table told a story in careful ink marks and annotations. Catherine's finger traced a line of X's marking suspicious deaths, each one circling closer to their mountain refuge. She'd been studying the pattern for hours, her brow furrowed in concentration. "They're methodical," she murmured, more to herself than to James. "Moving up from the southern claims, clearing out independent miners as they go." Her finger stopped at a fresh mark. The site of the wagon massacre. James looked up from cleaning his rifle, catching the way she swayed slightly with fatigue. 2 weeks had passed since she'd first opened her eyes in his cabin, and though her wounds were healing, the weight of their task wore on her. "You should rest." "I'm fine." But her hand went to her side where the worst injury was still mending. "Did you hear it again last night?" "The whistle." He nodded grimly. 3 nights running, he'd caught the sound of a distinct whistle carrying through the trees. "The Legion's signal," Catherine had explained. "They were being watched, their isolation tested." "We need to move the horses," James said, keeping his voice steady despite the tension coiling in his gut. "They're too exposed in the lower corral." He'd already found strange tracks in the snow that morning, circles of disturbed powder where someone had studied their defenses. Catherine's fingers worried the locket chain, another habit she shared with Sarah. "You don't have to stay," she said quietly. "This isn't your fight anymore. I could try to reach Whitman's mine alone." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. James softened his tone. "Sarah made it my fight when she died for it. I won't dishonor her memory by walking away now." Their eyes met across the table, understanding passing between them. In the firelight, the map's landmarks took on an ominous cast. Echo Canyon, Devil's Gulch, the maze of mining claims stretching into Legion territory. Somewhere in that dangerous landscape lay the evidence they needed, waiting in Thomas Whitman's hidden chamber. A log shifted in the fireplace, sending sparks up the chimney. Catherine started at the sound, her hand instinctively going to the revolver James had given her. She was a quick study with the weapon, though her eyes still held shadows of the wagon attack. "We're not alone in this," James reminded her, thinking of the names she'd shared, other victims of the Legion's expansion, people who'd lost loved ones to convenient accidents and mysterious disappearances. "When the snow clears," a branch snapped outside, too sharp to be natural. In one fluid motion, James extinguished the lamp, while Catherine rolled the map. Movements they'd practiced in anticipation of this moment. They pressed back against the cabin's walls, weapons ready, listening to the night. Boots crunched in the snow, 2 sets, maybe 3, circling the cabin's perimeter. The watchers had grown bold, testing their nerve, but James had survived. 5 years in these mountains by being cautious. The cabin's reinforced walls and carefully planned escape routes were about to prove their worth. In the darkness, he felt Catherine's presence beside him, her breathing steady despite their danger. She was Sarah's equal in courage, he'd learned, though she carried it differently. Where Sarah's strength had been subtle as a stream-wearing. A waystone, Catherine's burned like banked coals, waiting to flare. The footsteps faded, but James knew better than to relax. Dawn would show fresh tracks in the snow, another message from the Legion. "We're watching. We're coming. We know where you hide. Let them come," he thought grimly. Every day, Catherine grew stronger, their plans more refined, and when spring melted the snow from the mountain passes, they would be ready. The letter arrived with the stranger, an unopened envelope addressed to Sarah, its seal unbroken after 5 years. The man who brought it looked half dead from cold, his horse barely able to stand after fighting through the mountain snow. He'd collapsed at James's door just before sunset, clutching a leather satchel to his chest. "Martin Ross," Catherine whispered, recognition flooding her face as James helped the man to a chair. He was Thomas's contact in the land office. Ross's fingers trembled as he pulled the letter from his satchel. "Didn't know if I'd find you," he managed through chattering teeth. "They hit 3 more homesteads last week, getting bolder now that Judge Mackenzie's backing them openly." James pressed a cup of hot coffee into Ross's hands while Catherine tended to his frost-nipped fingers. The letter sat between them on the table. Sarah's neat handwriting, a ghost from the past. "She wrote it the morning she died," Ross said quietly. "Asked me to keep it safe. Deliver it if things went wrong. Been carrying it ever since, waiting for the right moment. When I heard whispers of a survivor from Echo Canyon wearing Sarah's locket..." He looked at Catherine. "Thomas always said you'd find a way." Catherine broke the seal with reverent care, unfolding the paper within. Her eyes widened as she read, color draining from her face. "James," she said softly, "you need to see this." The letter's contents would change everything they thought they knew about Sarah's last days and about the true reach of the Silver Legion's power. The silver bullet rolled across James's palm, its surface marked with the same symbol as the Queen of Hearts, the Legion's mountain peak and mine shaft. He'd found it embedded in the wall of Morton's general store, a warning shot that had missed its target 3 months ago. Now Morton himself stood before them, hands shaking, as he unlocked his private office. "Sarah used to help me with the books," Morton said quietly, glancing nervously at the darkened street outside. "Never knew she was really tracking the Legion's supply orders. Clever woman, your wife." James pocketed the bullet while Catherine examined the store's ledgers. They'd waited until full dark to make the trip into town, using the new moon's cover. Ross's news about Judge Mackenzie had forced their hand. They needed proof of the corruption before the spring assizes began. "Here," Catherine said, finger tracing down a column of numbers. "Large orders of blasting powder delivered to defunct mine claims. They're using legitimate businesses to hide their takeovers." She copied the details into her notebook, each entry building their case. Morton pulled a bottle from his desk drawer, took a long drink. "They killed my brother last spring, made it look like a mining accident, but Bill never worked the mines. He was a rancher like you were, James. His land just happened to sit over a silver vein." A familiar grief darkened the shopkeeper's eyes, one James knew too well. "We're building something, Mr. Morton, a case that will expose them all. But we need help." Catherine looked up from the ledgers. "Sarah's letter mentioned you had access to the territorial bank records, shipping manifests too." Morton's laugh held no humor. "That's what got your wife killed, Mrs. Maxwell. She found the connection between the bank president and the Legion's shell companies, followed the money trail right to Judge Mackenzie's door." He pulled a key from around his neck. "Everything's in the safe. I've been waiting 5 years for someone brave enough to use it." As Morton opened the safe, a floorboard creaked upstairs. All three froze, listening to the midnight silence of the store. Then, the unmistakable sound of a boot. On wooden stairs. "Back door," Morton whispered, shoving papers into Catherine's hands. "Through the storeroom. My wife will create a distraction up front." James drew his revolver, noting how naturally Catherine fell into position at his back, her own weapon. "Ready." They'd practiced this, prepared for discovery, but the reality of danger still made his heart race. They slipped into the storeroom just as voices carried from the shop floor. Martha Morton's cheerful greeting covering the sound of their exit. Outside, the winter air bit sharp and clean. Catherine clutched the precious documents to her chest as they moved through familiar alleys, staying in the shadows. "Wait," James whispered, pulling Catherine into a doorway. 2 riders passed at the street's end, rifles clearly visible. The Mason brothers, making their nightly patrol. Catherine's grip tightened on her revolver, but James shook his head. "Not yet. Not until they had everything in place. They made it back to their horses without incident, but James knew their luck wouldn't hold forever. The Legion's net was tightening, their watchers growing more numerous. Soon, hiding in his mountain cabin wouldn't be an option. "We need to see what's in those papers," Catherine said as they rode through the darkness. "Sarah died protecting this information. It has to be enough to break them." James thought of the silver bullet in his pocket, of Morton's grief-haunted eyes, of all the lives destroyed by the Legion's greed. "It will be," he promised. Sarah wouldn't have died for anything less. The moon remained hidden as they climbed, back into the mountains, but stars pierced the winter sky like silver holes in black velvet. Somewhere ahead lay their cabin's safety, but James knew it was temporary. The game had changed tonight. They had evidence now, real proof of the Legion's crimes. The next move would have to be bold. Catherine rode beside him, sure and steady, despite the treacherous trail. In her saddlebags, Morton's documents waited to reveal their secrets. And around her neck, Sarah's locket caught starlight like a promise. The company ledger lay open on the cabin table, its columns of numbers telling a story of systematic corruption. But James's attention was on Catherine as she squared off against him in the clearing behind the cabin, her borrowed coat too large, but her stance determined. "Again," he said, circling her slowly, "remember they'll expect you to hesitate. The Legion counts on decent folks having doubts." Catherine nodded, adjusting her grip on the revolver. 5 brass cartridges gleamed in the snow where she'd dropped them, her reloading time improving, but still too slow. They'd been at this for hours, the winter sun climbing overhead as James passed on everything he'd learned in 5 years of tracking outlaws. Like this? She moved suddenly, spinning to her left while drawing and firing in one smooth motion. The tin can target pinged satisfyingly. Her aim true. Better. James allowed himself a small smile. Sarah had been a natural with a rifle, but she disliked handguns. Catherine seemed to have an affinity for both. Now the reload. As she practiced, James's mind wandered to the meeting planned for sunset. Word had spread quietly through trusted channels. Morton's wife, the widow, Jenkins, old Marcus the blacksmith. People who'd lost something to the Legion. People Sarah had trusted. "Ryder coming," Catherine said suddenly, her hand going to her gun. But James had already recognized the approaching hoofbeats. "It's Rachel," he said, holstering his weapon. "Right on time." Rachel Jenkins rode into view, her black dress stark against the snow. At 35, she was the youngest widow in the valley, her husband Tom having died in one of the Legion's early accidents. She'd been Sarah's closest friend, though James hadn't known until reading his wife's letter how deeply Rachel had been involved in the investigation. "Morton's papers are genuine," Rachel announced without preamble, dismounting gracefully. "I cross-referenced them with Tom's old surveying maps. The Legion's been building hidden shafts, connecting them underground to legitimate claims. When they collapse one shaft, they can still work the vein through another," Catherine finished. "While the rightful owners are dead or driven off. Clever and profitable." Rachel pulled more papers from her saddlebag. "I brought the latest. Bank records. Judge Mackenzie's been busy. 3 new accounts opened under different names, all flush with silver money." They moved inside where James had coffee waiting. Catherine cleared the targets away, while Rachel spread the new documents across the table. The pieces were coming together, forming a picture of corruption so vast it took their breath away. "How many will come tonight?" Catherine asked, warming her hands around her coffee cup. 12, Rachel replied. "All vetted, all with reason to hate the Legion. Marcus is bringing his nephew. The boy's got access to the mining office, been copying documents for months. And Mary Chen from the telegraph office. She's been tracking the Legion's communications, keeping a record." James nodded approvingly. Sarah had chosen her allies well, building a network of ordinary people whose very normalcy made them invisible to the Legion's suspicions. Now that network was awakening, ready to finish what she'd started. "They'll need training," he said, glancing at the firearms lined up near the door. "Not just shooting. How to move quiet, how to watch without being seen. The Legion's men are professionals. So we'll become professionals too." Catherine's voice held steel. She'd improved remarkably in the weeks since her arrival, her wounds healing as her resolve hardened. "Rachel, what about the sheriff?" Rachel's face darkened. "Bought and paid." "Euphor, but his deputy, Jackson. He's been asking questions since his brother disappeared last fall. He might be persuaded." They spent the afternoon planning, marking potential allies and enemies on their maps, building lists of resources and vulnerabilities. James watched Catherine absorb every detail, asking sharp questions that showed her strategic mind. She reminded him of Sarah in those moments, not in appearance or manner, but in that core of absolute determination. As the sun began to set, riders approached in twos and threes. James recognized Marcus's heavy tread, Mary Chen's delicate mare, the Jenkins boy leading his uncle's wagon. Good people, normal people, each carrying a burden of loss that had finally found purpose. They gathered around the cabin's large hearth, faces grave but determined. James studied them as Catherine and Rachel laid out the evidence they'd gathered. Morton's ledgers, the bank records, Mary's telegraph logs. These weren't gunfighters or heroes from dime novels. They were shopkeepers, farmers, clerks. But they had something the Legion didn't expect: the righteous anger of the wronged and the patience to wait for the perfect moment to strike. "Spring thaw's coming," James told them. "When the pass is clear, the Legion will make their move on the northern claims. But this time, we'll be ready. This time, we'll have proof of every crime, every murder, every corrupt deal. And we'll have something else." "What's that?" Marcus's nephew asked, leaning forward eagerly. James met Catherine's eyes across the room, saw his own determination reflected there. "We'll have justice. For Sarah, for Tom Jenkins, for every person they've killed thinking they could act with impunity. The Legion believes they're hunting us. Time to show them what it feels like to be the prey." The meeting lasted well into the night, plans taking shape as snow fell softly outside. One by one, their allies departed, each carrying a piece of the larger strategy. Tomorrow, the real work would begin: training, gathering intelligence, building the case that would bring down an empire of corruption. As James banked the fire for the night, he found Catherine still studying the company ledger, her fingers tracing the columns of damning numbers. The weight of Sarah's locket gleamed at her throat. "We'll need every advantage," she said without looking up. "They've had years to build their power." "True," James agreed, "but they've never faced anything like this. Ordinary folks who finally had enough." Sarah understood that. It's why she built her network so carefully. Catherine touched the locket, a gesture that no longer pained him to watch. "She'd be proud of this, of all of them, of you." James thought of the 12 determined faces that had filled his cabin, each carrying a piece of Sarah's legacy without having known it. "Yes," he said quietly, "I believe she would." The pocket watch was solid silver, heavy in James's palm. He'd found it in the snow outside his cabin, its surface etched with the Legion's mountain peak symbol. More telling was the inscription inside: "To Daniel, my faithful enforcer, Judge Mackenzie." "Daniel Chen," Catherine breathed, her face pale in the lamplight. "Mary's husband." The revelation hit like a physical blow. Mary Chen, their trusted ally from the telegraph office, the quiet woman who documented the Legion's communications. Her husband was their enforcer. Every plan they'd shared, every name in their growing network, had been compromised. "We need to warn the others," James said, already reaching for his coat. But Catherine caught his arm. "Listen." Outside, the wind had died completely. In that unnatural silence, they heard it, the soft crunch of multiple boots in snow surrounding the cabin. The watch had been left as a message: "We're done waiting." "How many?" Catherine whispered, moving to her position by the window. "Too many." James counted at least 6 shadows moving through the trees. "Rachel was supposed to check on Marcus tonight. They'll hit there too." Catherine's voice held cold certainty. "We need to split up, warn as many as we can." James wanted to argue, to keep her close where he could protect her, but she was right. Their allies were scattered across town, vulnerable and unaware, and Catherine wasn't the wounded stranger he'd found in the snow anymore. She was a fighter now, as capable as any of them. "Take the tunnel," he said, moving to the fireplace. "I'll create a distraction." They had prepared for this, built escape routes and cached supplies. As James shifted the hearthstones to reveal the hidden passage, Catherine gathered their most crucial documents. The company ledger and bank records went into her satchel, along with Sarah's letter. "The rendezvous point," she said, checking her revolvers. 2 days. James nodded. "The old Whitman mine, either they'd meet there or not at all." He touched her shoulder briefly, words unnecessary between them now. Then Catherine disappeared into the tunnel with their evidence and hopes, silent as a shadow. James reset the hearthstones and waited until he was sure she was clear. Then he opened the front door and stepped onto his porch, hands raised. "Evening, Daniel," he called into the darkness. "That's a fine watch you dropped." The Legion's enforcer emerged from the shadows, his face as bland and forgettable as ever. How many times had he sat in James's cabin, listening to their plans while Mary gave her reports? The thought made his blood boil. "Sarah had a similar watch," Daniel said conversationally. "She showed it to me right before she died. Tried to buy me off with mining shares." He smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. "Some folks never learn. You can't fight progress." "Is that what you call murder?" "Business." Daniel gestured, and his men began to emerge from cover. "Nothing personal, Hawkins, but we can't have you stirring up trouble." "Where's Mrs. Maxwell?" "Gone." James let his satisfaction show. "With enough evidence to hang you all." Daniel's smile didn't waver. "That's why we're hitting every safe house tonight. Your evidence won't matter if there's no one left to testify." He drew his gun with casual grace. "Last chance, Hawkins. Tell me where she went and I'll make it quick, like I did for Sarah." James had wondered for 5 years what kind of man had killed his wife. Now, facing Daniel's empty smile, he understood. Not a monster, not a cruel villain from penny novels, just a man doing business. His fingers brushed the Queen of Hearts in his pocket as he answered, "Go to hell." The night erupted in gunfire. Catherine pressed her back against a snow-laden pine as gunfire echoed through the valley below. James's cabin was a distant flicker of orange. Burning, she realized with a cold knot in her stomach. She'd been fighting her way up the mountain for hours, using the growing storm as cover. Sarah's diary weighed heavy in her coat pocket, separate from the satchel of evidence. She'd grabbed it on impulse while gathering documents. Something about its worn leather cover calling to her. Now, sheltering from both storm and pursuit, she pulled it out with half-frozen fingers. The last entry was dated the day Sarah died. Catherine had read it before, but never by stormlight, with gunshots echoing in her ears. The words took on new meaning. "Daniel suspects nothing, though he watches me constantly. Mary's good heart blinds her to what he is. The silver claims were never the Legion's true goal. They're a means to an end. Judge Mackenzie's letter proves it. They're building something in the deep mines, something that requires absolute secrecy. Thomas was right about the government. Contracts, if we don't stop them now." The entry ended there. But tucked between the pages, Catherine found something she'd missed before. A small key, wrapped in a scrap of paper bearing a single word, Genesis. Thunder rolled across the mountains, or perhaps it was more gunfire. Catherine tucked the diary away and forced herself to move. The old Whitman mine waited somewhere ahead in the storm. James would come if he could, but right now, her duty was to protect what Sarah had died for. She touched the locket at her throat and pushed on into the howling dark. The mine deed's yellowed edges crumbled as Catherine unfolded it in the shelter of the cave entrance. She'd been holed up for hours, waiting out both storm and pursuers when the headache hit. The kind that had preceded every fragment of returned memory since the wagon attack. But this time was different. This time, everything came rushing back. She remembered now. The day Sarah had first contacted her, not as a fellow investigator, but as family. "My dearest cousin," the letter had begun. "I pray this finds you well, and that you'll forgive the years of silence. What I'm about to tell you explains everything about your father's death in the mines, about why your mother moved you away so suddenly, about the inheritance that was stolen from us both." Catherine pressed her temples as the memories flooded in. She'd been young when they left Wyoming Territory, too young to understand why her mother wept as they boarded the train east. Only later, working as a clerk in Boston's mining offices, did she begin to piece together the truth about her father's accident. The documentation of Legion corruption had started as personal vengeance, but then she'd found Sarah's letter, discovered their shared blood, learned of her cousin's parallel. Investigation. Sarah, the country schoolteacher with a mind like a steel trap, had already built a network of allies and informants. Together, they could have brought down the entire operation. Genesis, Catherine whispered, looking at the key again. The word triggered another memory, her father's voice, reading from his leather notebook. The Genesis claim, deepest silver vein in the territory. Worth a fortune if we can prove it's there. He died a week later. More pieces clicked into place. The government contracts mentioned in Sarah's diary, the judge's secret meetings, the Legion's desperate need for control of specific mines. They weren't just stealing silver claims. They were hiding something in the deep shafts, something worth killing to protect. Catherine's fingers went to the locket, understanding finally why Sarah had arranged for her to have it. Inside was a tiny key mark that matched the one on her father's original Genesis claim map, the claim that rightfully belonged to both their families. A sound at the cave's mouth made her freeze. But the figure that emerged from the swirling snow was familiar. Rachel Jenkins, her black dress replaced by men's trousers and a heavy coat. "James?" Catherine asked, dreading the answer. "Alive," Rachel said, shaking snow from her hat. "Wounded, but he got away. Daniel's men were too busy with the fire to chase him far." She took in Catherine's pale face. "What is it? What's wrong?" "I remember everything now." Catherine handed her the diary, open to Sarah's last entry. "The Legion, the judge, the government contracts, it's all connected to something in the Genesis claim, something worth killing 2 generations of my family to hide." Rachel's eyes widened as she read. "Mary Chen arrived at my house just before. Daniel's men. She didn't know Catherine, about her husband, about any of it. She gave me this before they took her." She pulled a folded paper from her coat, a telegram transcript, dated the week of Sarah's murder. It was in code, but Catherine recognized the signature, Office of War Department Acquisitions. "Whatever they're hiding down there," Rachel said quietly, "it's bigger than silver mining." Outside, the storm began to ease, revealing a cold moon above the mountain peaks. Catherine thought of James, wounded but alive, carrying his own revelations about Sarah's death. They'd started this seeking simple justice. Now they were uncovering something far darker, far more dangerous. She touched the locket again, feeling the hidden map mark beneath her fingers. "Sarah knew," she said softly. "She knew they'd kill her for getting too close. That's why she arranged everything. The letter to me, the evidence trail, making sure I'd find James. She was building an army to finish what our fathers started." Rachel checked her pistols with grim determination. "Then let's not waste her sacrifice. The Whitman mine connects to the Genesis claim through the old shaft system. If we can get there before Daniel realizes what we know..." Catherine nodded, gathering their precious documents. The storm had given them cover, but dawn would bring renewed pursuit. It was time to take the fight to the Legion's own territory, to uncover whatever secret was worth so much blood. She thought of James, hoping he'd understand when he found their new trail. Some truths were worth any risk to expose. The cave map trembled in Catherine's hands as she held it close to the lantern's dim light. Beside her, Rachel traced the connecting tunnels with her finger. Both women crouched in the narrow passage that linked the Whitman mine to the deeper shaft system. "Thomas marked all the Legion's guard posts," Rachel whispered, indicating small crosses on the weathered paper. "But this section here," she pointed to a blank area near the Genesis claim. "No marks at all, like he couldn't get close enough to map it." They'd been moving through the mine complex for hours, using the old maintenance tunnels that honeycombed the mountain. The air grew thicker as they descended, heavy with more than just coal dust and time. There was purpose in the modernized support beams. The fresh track marks in the dirt, signs of recent activity far below the abandoned upper shafts. Listen, Catherine held up her hand. Somewhere ahead, metal rang against metal, echoing through the tunnels. They extinguished their lantern and waited in darkness as boots scraped on stone, voices murmuring just out of reach. "Shift change," Rachel breathed. "Right on schedule." They pressed against the tunnel wall as two miners passed the intersection. Ahead, their lamps casting long shadows. But these weren't ordinary miners. Their holstered revolvers and military bearing marked them as Legion men. When the sound of boots faded, Catherine retrieved Sarah's diary from her coat. The government contracts Sarah mentioned. She thought they were using silver shipments as cover for something else. Something they're storing down here. Or building. Rachel's voice was grim. "Look at these support structures. They're new, engineered for heavy loads. Whatever's down there, they've spent years preparing for it." They moved deeper, following Thomas's map through a maze of side tunnels until they reached a heavy iron door. Catherine's hand went to the locket at her throat, feeling the tiny key mark that matched the claim boundaries on their map. This is it. The entrance to the Genesis claim. The lock was modern, but Rachel produced a set of picks with a grim smile. "Tom wasn't just a surveyor. He taught me a few tricks before they killed him." As Rachel worked on the lock, Catherine kept watch, her mind racing. Everything linked back to this place. Her father's death, Sarah's murder, the Legion's desperate grip on the territory. Behind this door lay answers they'd died trying to expose. The lock clicked open with surprising softness. Beyond lay a short tunnel that opened into a vast chamber, and there they found what the Legion had been hiding. Catherine's breath caught. The chamber was filled with massive machinery, gleaming with polish and purpose. Strange devices lined the walls, their copper coils and brass fittings unlike anything she'd seen before. At the center stood what could only be described as a weapon, but one that belonged in the pages of a scientific romance, not a silver mine in Wyoming. "My God," Rachel whispered. "The War Department. They're not just buying silver." Movement above caught their attention. On a metal walkway overlooking the chamber, a familiar figure stood examining blueprints spread across a table. Daniel Chen, the Legion's enforcer, the man who'd killed Sarah. And beside him, Judge Mackenzie. Catherine's hand tightened on her revolver. The territorial judge looked different here than he did in his courthouse, more militant than judicial, his usual robes replaced by a uniform she didn't recognize. They ducked behind machinery as more men entered the chamber. Through the gaps, Catherine could see workers assembling components, fitting strange glowing tubes into copper housings. Whatever they were building, it was nearly complete. Rachel touched her arm, pointing to a stack of documents on a nearby desk. Carefully, they eased closer. Letterhead marked with the War Department seal confirmed their suspicions. This was a government project hidden in plain sight behind the Legion's silver mining operation. "Impossible weapons," Catherine breathed, scanning the papers. "Things that could change the course of wars. That's what they're protecting. And why they'll kill anyone who discovers it." Rachel's voice was steel. "We need to get this evidence out, all of it." But as they gathered the documents, an alarm bell rang somewhere above. Boots thundered on metal walkways as Daniel's voice cut through the chamber. "Check the lower levels. They have to be here somewhere." Catherine met Rachel's eyes in the dim light. They were trapped in the heart of the Legion's secret, surrounded by armed men, with nowhere to run but deeper into the mine. The Genesis claim had given up its secret. At last, the question now was whether they'd live long enough to expose it. The conspiracy letter trembled in Judge Mackenzie's hands as he read it aloud, his voice echoing through the chamber. It was Sarah's final message. The one she'd written the morning of her death, detailing everything she'd uncovered about the secret weapons program. "Remarkable woman, your cousin," he said, looking at Catherine where she stood surrounded by Legion men, Rachel beside her. She pieced it all together. The War Department contracts, the foreign buyers. even the test. Sights would have exposed everything if Daniel hadn't stopped her. You mean murdered her, Catherine spat. Above them, the strange machines hummed with deadly purpose, their copper coils casting an eerie glow. She gave me no choice, Daniel said, from his position by the door. His bland smile was gone, replaced by something harder. I offered her a place in the operation. She was smart enough to be useful. But Sarah, he shook his head, she had principles. Like her uncle, Mackenzie added, eyes fixing on Catherine. Your father was the same way. Wouldn't be bought, wouldn't look the other way. Found this facility during a routine mining survey, and thought he had a duty to report it. The pieces clicked into place. That's why you had him killed. Why you drove us from our land. The Genesis claim was too important, Mackenzie said simply. These weapons will change the balance of power in ways you can't imagine. Countries will pay fortunes for what we've developed here. Sarah understood the scale of it. That's why she spent years building her network of witnesses and evidence, insurance in case something happened to her. And now that network is destroyed, Daniel added. Your friend Hawkins is probably dead in the snow. The others are being rounded up as we speak. No one left to verify your story. But Catherine smiled, her hand going to the locket. Sarah thought of that too. She knew someone would reach this point eventually. That's why she arranged everything so carefully. The locket, the diary, leading me to James. She made sure her death wouldn't be the end. What are you talking about? Mackenzie demanded. Mary Chen sent copies of everything to newspapers. In Denver and San Francisco before you took her, Rachel said quietly. If we don't report in by tomorrow, it all becomes public. The weapons program, the murders, the corruption, everything. Daniel's gun came up, but Mackenzie held up his hand. Wait, where are the copies? You'll never find them, Catherine said, but I'll make you a deal, the same one you offered Sarah. Let us walk out of here, leave the territory with our lives, and the stories stay buried. You'd protect these secrets after everything they've cost you? Mackenzie studied her face. No, Catherine said softly. I'd honor Sarah's real plan. She knew these weapons were too dangerous to ever see the light of day. Better they stay hidden than start a war that could destroy everything. Understanding dawned in Mackenzie's eyes, but before he could speak, a new voice rang out from the shadows. She's stalling. The sheriff's badge glinted in the strange light as James Hawkins stepped out of the shadows, Deputy Jackson and 6 armed men moving with him. His left arm hung stiffly at his side, bandaged but functional. His eyes met Catherine's for a brief moment, conveying volumes. We've been down here for hours, he said calmly, his gun trained on Daniel. Heard everything. Mary Chen showed us the back way in. Seems her husband wasn't as careful with his maps as he thought. Daniel's bland mask cracked for the first time, showing real fear. You're supposed to be dead. Sorry to disappoint. James's voice was ice. Drop your weapons, all of you. Deputy Jackson here has a warrant from the Federal Marshal's office. Mackenzie laughed, but it held a desperate edge. You think a local warrant means anything here? This is a government installation. We have authority. Straight from who? Jackson cut in. The War Department's already disavowing all knowledge. Seems they don't take kindly to their scientists selling weapons to foreign powers. Mary Chen provided quite a stack of coded telegrams proving those negotiations. Catherine watched the color drain from Mackenzie's face as more men emerged from the tunnels, faces she recognized from their meetings in James's cabin, now wearing deputy badges. They'd survived the Legion's attack, rallied under James's leadership. Sarah knew, she said softly, understanding flowing through her. She knew we'd need official authority to bring you down legally. That's why she contacted the Marshal's office before she died, why she left a trail for them to follow. Your wife, Daniel snarled at James, was a meddling fool who... The gunshot caught Daniel in the shoulder, spinning him against the wall. James's revolver hadn't wavered. That's for Sarah, he said quietly. The rest will come through the courts. Everything happened quickly after that. Mackenzie tried to run, but Rachel was faster, taking him down with a skillful tackle. Legion men dropped their weapons, seeing the odds had turned. Deputy Jackson read out charges: murder, corruption, treason, his voice echoing off the machinery that would never now be used. As they led Daniel away, he turned to Catherine. "You're just like her, you know, Sarah, too stubborn to see the bigger picture." "No," Catherine replied. "We saw it perfectly. Some powers aren't meant to be unleashed. Some prices are too high." Later, as they climbed back to the surface, James fell into step beside her. "Mary Chen found me after the cabin fire, told me everything. We gathered the survivors, contacted Jackson. He'd been building his own case for months." "Sarah would be proud," Catherine said. "Justice done properly through the law." James nodded toward the deputies escorting their prisoners. "These men lost family to the Legion too. They wanted revenge, but this is better. The truth exposed, the guilty facing judgment. No more shadows, no more secrets." The first light of dawn was breaking as they emerged from the mine. Catherine touched the locket one last time, then unclasped it. "This belongs with Sarah," she said, holding it out to James. But he closed her fingers over it gently. "Keep it. She wanted you to have it, to remember that justice is worth any price, but vengeance only stains the soul." Together they watched the sun rise over the mountains, its light touching the badge on James's chest, a symbol of law returning to a territory too long ruled by corruption and fear. A new locket caught the spring sunlight as Catherine stood before Sarah's grave, its fresh-cut design a mirror of the old one she still wore. Around her, the town cemetery bloomed with early wildflowers, the same kind Sarah had once pressed. Between book pages, "The trials ended yesterday," she said softly to the headstone. "Mackenzie and Daniel will hang. The others got prison terms." She knelt to place flowers, not store-bought but wild blooms gathered from the mountainside. Mary Chen testified against her husband. That took real courage. Behind her, boot steps crunched on gravel. James approached slowly, respecting. A moment of communion. He looked different now, still weathered but lighter somehow. The badge he wore wasn't a temporary deputy's star anymore, but the full sheriff's shield the town had insisted he accept. Rachel's opening the school. "Again," he said when Catherine stood. "Says it's what Sarah would have wanted. The children shouldn't lose another teacher to darkness." Catherine nodded, touching the new locket. Inside wasn't a map key or secret message, but a simple photograph, Sarah and James on their wedding day, her face bright with joy. James had given it to her yesterday, along with copies for every member of their unlikely alliance. "The War Department sealed the Genesis claim," she said. "Filled the shafts with concrete. Whatever they were building down there will stay buried." "Good." James's voice was firm. "Some secrets should rest in peace." They walked together through the cemetery, past other graves that bore witness to the Legion's years of power. Thomas Whitman, Catherine's father, Tom Jenkins, all the others who died protecting the truth. But their deaths had meaning now, their sacrifices honored by justice served. The town was healing. Mary Chen had reopened the telegraph office, monitoring communications for any hint of remaining corruption. Marcus's nephew was learning the blacksmith trade properly now. No more need for covert document copying. Morton's store flourished, his ledgers clean and honest. "I received a letter from my mother," Catherine said as they reached the cemetery gate. "She's coming home. Says it's time to reclaim what was taken from us." James smiled slightly. "The territory's changing. Good people stepping into the light again." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Your father's old ranch, the one next to my land. It's been sitting empty all these years." Catherine understood what he wasn't quite saying. They'd grown close during the investigation and trials, their shared mission becoming something more. But neither wanted to rush, to dishonor Sarah's memory with haste. "It needs work," she said. "The house, the fences, everything." "I'm good with repairs," James offered. "And I know someone who's learned her way around a ranch." Catherine thought of Sarah's diary entries about building a life with James. how she'd described the daily rhythms of ranch work as a kind of poetry. Perhaps she'd known, somehow, that Catherine would one day understand those words firsthand. "We'll take it slow," she said. "Do things proper." James nodded, satisfaction in his eyes. They'd both learned that the best things, justice, healing, love, couldn't be rushed. Had to be built carefully, mindfully, with respect for what came before. The new locket caught the sun again as they walked back toward town. Behind them, Sarah's grave stood peaceful among the wildflowers, her legacy living on in ways she might never have imagined, but would surely have approved. The ranch deed felt rough under Catherine's fingers as she traced its newly inked signatures. Spring winds swept across the restored front porch where she sat with her mother, the same porch where her father had once taught her to read. "He would have loved this," her mother said softly, watching the ranch hands, James among them, mending the north pasture fence. Seeing the land come back to life. 3 months of hard work had transformed the abandoned ranch. New boards replaced rotted ones, fresh paint brightened weathered walls, and the garden Sarah had loved so much bloomed again under Catherine's careful tending. She'd planted the same flowers her cousin had favored, a living memorial more fitting than any granite monument. James approached the porch, removing his hat. He'd been teaching Catherine the business of ranching, just as Sarah had once taught him to read and heal. The partnership felt natural, their different strengths complementing each other like adjacent pieces of a long, scattered puzzle. "Morton's bringing supplies tomorrow," he reported. "Says the whole town wants to help with the barn raising." Catherine smiled, remembering how the community had rallied around them. Rachel Jenkins rode out weekly to help with the books. Mary Chen kept them informed of territory news, and even the new federal marshal made regular visits to ensure no hint of corruption took root again. "Sarah's old recipes are helping," Catherine's mother added, gesturing to the herb garden. "The ones she wrote in her diary, I've been teaching them to Dr. Wilson's apprentice. Healing knowledge shouldn't die with its keeper." James sat on the porch steps, comfortable now in their family circle. "The sheriff's office is quiet these days. People settling disputes proper through the law." His badge caught the sunlight. "Deputy Jackson's proving a fine replacement for my daily duties." They all understood what he wasn't saying, that he was ready to set the badge aside, return to ranching full-time. The territory had healed enough to let its guardians rest. "The new silver claims are being worked honest," Catherine reported. "Real miners, fair wages. Even found some of Thomas's old students supervising the engineering." She touched the locket at her throat, its familiar weight now a comfort rather than a burden. Everything they fought for, died for. "It's happening." Her mother reached over and squeezed her hand. They'd spent long evenings sharing memories of Catherine's father, of Sarah, of all the quiet heroes who'd stood against corruption. Their stories weren't lost anymore, but woven into the fabric of the territories. "Renewal." James stood, offering his hand to Catherine. "Sunset check of the herd." She took it, feeling the calluses that matched her own growing ones. They'd been courting proper under her mother's approving eye, learning each other as carefully as they'd learned the ranch's rhythms. Together, they rode out as the day's heat softened into evening gold. The cattle grew fat on spring grass, the mountains stood peaceful against the darkening sky, and 2 hearts beat in quiet synchronization. Life wasn't perfect. Grief still. Visited in quiet moments, memories brought both joy and pain, but they were building something true on the foundation of sacrifice and justice. Something Sarah would have recognized and blessed. The legacy she'd left wasn't just in exposed corruption or righted wrongs. It lived in every honest silver claim, every new settler working their land in peace, every child learning in Rachel's schoolroom. It lived in James and Catherine, healing together, proving that love could grow from the ashes of loss without diminishing what came before. As stars began to pierce the twilight, they turned their horses toward home. The ranch lights glowed welcome, and the future stretched before them like a trail waiting to be explored. The family photograph captured a moment of perfect balance. James and Catherine on their wedding day, standing before the restored ranch house where two stories of love had bloomed. She wore Sarah's locket, he his smooth silver ring, both symbols carrying memories that had transformed from wounds to wisdom. Among the wedding guests, a new generation of settlers worked the silver gleams with honest hands. Mary Chen's daughter taught in Rachel's schoolhouse, carrying forward Sarah's legacy of education. The mountains still held their secrets, but now they were the natural mysteries of the land, not the dark conspiracies of corrupt men. And in the garden Sarah had first planted, wildflowers still bloomed each spring, proving that beauty could flourish anywhere, especially in places where justice and love had finally conquered fear. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.